It was 2:47 a.m. when the sound of metal scraping across asphalt jolted Jake Miller out of sleep. At first, he thought it was a dream. But then came the clatter of chains, followed by a low, guttural growl that could only mean one thing. Thor and Loki were on alert. Jake's heart kicked into overdrive. He reached for the small security monitor on his nightstand. The black and white screen flickered, and there they were, two shadowy figures, crouched in his driveway, struggling to hook his 1969 Dodge Charger to the back of a battered tow truck. He blinked, sat up straight. Who the hell were these guys? Jake had dealt with the HOA's nonsense before, passive-aggressive notes, fines for grass height, even threats about his non-compliant mailbox color. But this was next level. He barely had time to grab his phone before Thor and Loki exploded out of the bedroom, claws tapping hard against the wood floor as they sprinted for the front door. He flicked on the porch light and flung the door open just as one of the men outside let out a panicked yell. "Holy dude, there are dogs! Big dogs!" The guy stumbled backward, tripping over a coil of chain as Loki, an enormous wall of muscle, fur, and teeth, charged the front gate. Thor, slightly smaller but just as fierce, stalked forward like a silent assassin. Both men froze. Their so-called uniforms, cheap navy blue shirts with HOA enforcement printed in fading white letters, looked like something bought off eBay and ironed on in a hurry. Jake stepped out onto the porch, barefoot, pissed, and not in the mood for theatrics. "Who are you?" he shouted. "And what the hell do you think you're doing?" One of the guys, tall and twitchy, tried to act cool. He cleared his throat and puffed up his chest like he was some kind of authority. "We're authorized to tow this vehicle," he said, fumbling for something in his pocket. "You're in violation of community standards. This car's been classified as an eyesore." Jake laughed, the sound sharp and disbelieving. "An eyesore," he repeated, pointing at the mint-condition black Charger gleaming under the porch lights. "That's a classic. A collector's dream? You people wouldn't know real value if it bit you in the ass." The second guy, shorter, bulkier, and clearly not ready for this, mumbled, "We have to tow it. Orders from the HOA." "No," Jake said flatly. "You really don't." He stepped forward. Loki growled, low and threatening. "You have 5 seconds to get off my property before I let the dogs handle this." The short one turned to his partner. "Maybe we should call Karen." Jake's jaw clenched. Of course. Karen Monroe, the HOA president who had made it her life's mission to turn Jake's into hell the moment he moved into Temecula Oaks. She lived for drama, loved control, and apparently now she'd graduated from fines to attempted theft. "You think Karen has the authority to steal my car?" Jake asked, folding his arms. "Last I checked, the HOA doesn't outrank the police. And what you're doing right now? That's called grand theft auto." The tall one's smirk faltered. We have paperwork." Jake stepped down from the porch, slow and deliberate. "Show me." The man hesitated. His hand hovered near his back pocket. But he didn't pull anything out. He was bluffing, and Jake knew it. The second guy was sweating now. "Dude, this isn't worth it. Let's just go." "You're not going anywhere," Jake snapped, raising his phone. "Because I just called the cops." The men froze. The driver glanced toward the tow truck, calculating. Could he unhook the car and disappear before sirens showed up? Then Thor barked, one sharp, commanding sound that echoed across the street like a war drum. That did it. The two scrambled to detach the chains, yanking them off the Charger in a frantic rush. Within seconds, the truck's tires squealed as they bolted down the road like cockroaches with flashlights turned on them. Jake stood there, barefoot in the cool night air, watching them disappear. The audacity, the nerve, but most of all, the stupidity. Because he knew this wasn't over. Karen wouldn't stop. Not after this. She'd take it as a challenge. Thor and Loki padded back to his side, tails wagging like nothing had happened. He crouched to scratch behind their ears. "Good boys." The cops arrived 15 minutes later, but the fake tow guys were long gone. Jake gave his statement, showed them the footage. "They were wearing fake HOA uniforms?" the officer asked, taking notes. "Yeah, unless the HOA started hiring felons with clip-on badges, I'd say these guys weren't official." The officer sighed. "Wouldn't be the first time. Probably scammers targeting high-value cars. Keep your cameras rolling. If they come back, call us." Jake nodded, but his mind was already moving 10 steps ahead. He wasn't going to sit around waiting for them to try again. Next time, he'd be ready. By 7 o'clock a.m., Jake was already parked in front of the biggest, most ridiculous house in the neighborhood, Karen Monroe's fortress. The oversized Mediterranean-style home stood at the end of a perfectly paved cul-de-sac, complete with 2 lion statues flanking the driveway and a lawn so aggressively manicured it looked photoshopped in real life. Jake didn't bother ringing the bell. He knocked. Hard. A full 30 seconds passed before the door creaked open, revealing the woman of the hour in all her smug glory. Karen Monroe, mid-50s, blonde bob cut like she just stepped out of a catalog called Passive-Aggressive Power, wearing a silk robe and clutching a mug that said, "HOA Life chose me." "Ah, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice syrupy. "What a surprise." Jake smiled. Not the warm kind. The "I'm this close to snapping" kind. "Save it," he said. "You sent those guys to steal my car last night." Karen blinked. One long, exaggerated blink, as if she were insulted that he dared accuse her before breakfast. "Steal?" she echoed with a dry laugh. "Oh, no, no, no. The HOA simply enforces community standards. Your vehicle, I'm afraid, no longer meets the aesthetic guidelines." Jake took a deep breath, fighting the urge to scream. "They were wearing fake uniforms. They weren't even licensed tow operators. They were criminals." Karen tilted her head, fake concern painted across her face like a cheap mural. "Well," she said slowly, "that's your opinion." He stepped closer. "I have video footage, clear as day. I know what you're trying to do." Karen didn't flinch. She took a sip of her coffee like she'd heard this speech 100 times. "If you feel so strongly, perhaps take it up with the board," she said with a sweet, poisonous smile. "Oh, I will," Jake replied. "And with the police." For a second, just a second, Karen's expression cracked. A hairline fracture in her composure, but she recovered instantly. "I do hope you're not making threats, Mr. Miller." "I'm not," Jake said. "I'm making promises." He turned without another word and walked back to his truck. As he drove home, the adrenaline began to wear off, but his resolve only hardened. This wasn't just HOA overreach anymore. It was personal, targeted, calculated, and he wasn't the only one who noticed. That afternoon, Jake's phone lit up with texts from neighbors. Some were angry, others confused. A few were loyal Karen worshippers, parroting whatever garbage she fed them. But most, they were done. "Bro, they tried to tow your car? WTF is going on with the HOA? Did Karen really send people at 3 a.m.? Jake ignored the drama and pulled up his security footage again. The 2 men hadn't just stumbled in with a hook and a truck. They'd moved like professionals, checking for cameras, disabling lights, trying to come in low and fast. One of them had even tried to mask the plates. This wasn't some amateur stunt. This was a hit job. And Karen? She was involved in something way bigger than a grudge against his muscle car. That's when Jake made the call. Tom Rizzo, retired detective, now a private investigator, the kind of guy who knew how to connect dots, especially when they were drawn in crayon by idiots who thought HOA power gave them immunity. Tom answered on the second ring. "Tell me Karen finally snapped," he said. "She tried to repo my car in the middle of the night," Jake replied. Tom whistled. "Well, that's a new one." Jake dropped a flash drive onto Tom's desk an hour later. Tom plugged it in, his smirk fading as the footage played. "These guys aren't your everyday morons," he muttered. "They're organized. The fake uniforms, the tow truck, the way they move. They've done this before." Jake crossed his arms. "So it's a scam?" Tom replayed a frame, pausing when one of the men turned toward the camera. He squinted. "I know this guy." He clicked over to his desktop, pulled up a police database, and began typing. A minute later, Tom leaned back, eyebrows raised. "Well, well, well." Jake waited. "Name's Reggie Solano. Fraud, auto theft, breaking and entering. Oh, and here's the best part. He's been linked to multiple HOA scams up and down the West Coast. Same playbook. Declare a violation, tow the car, resell, or strip it for parts." Jake didn't even blink. "So Karen's working with car thieves." "Looks that way," Tom said. "And if she's smart, she's got paperwork to make it all seem legit on the surface. But it's dirty underneath." Jake clenched his fists. His car wasn't just a car. It was his dad's, restored over 5 years with money, sweat, and memories. "She picked the wrong guy this time," he said. Tom grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that, because I've got a few tricks left too." Later that evening, Jake's phone rang again. Unknown number. He picked up. A robotic voice crackled through the speaker. "Your vehicle is scheduled for towing tomorrow due to continued violations. Please contact HOA enforcement to resolve this matter." Jake raised an eyebrow. It was so stupid it was almost impressive. He played along. "Oh no," he said in fake panic. "Can I just pay a fine instead?" The robot voice hesitated. "That may be arranged." "Oh, fantastic," Jake said cheerfully. "Who do I pay?" "We will contact you with further instructions." As soon as the call ended, Jake dialed Tom. "They just tried to extort me." "Perfect," Tom replied. "Means they're getting desperate." Jake stared out the window at his Charger, still parked perfectly in the driveway. Desperate people make mistakes, and Karen had just made hers. "They came back at midnight, but this time I set the trap." Jake didn't waste a second. The moment he hung up with Tom, he switched into full defense mode, but with a twist. This time he wasn't just defending his car, he was hunting. He walked outside and stared at the Charger. The glossy black paint reflected the porch lights like a mirror. It looked peaceful, untouched. But that peace was about to get very, very expensive for someone else. Jake got to work. He replaced his real security cameras with dummies, cheap ones with blinking red lights that screamed, "Look at me," to anyone dumb enough to fall for it. Meanwhile, the real cameras, newly installed and hidden in the trees, the mailbox, even the grill of a nearby junker car, captured every inch of his front yard in crystal clear HD. But that was just the beginning. He installed a GPS tracker under the Charger's frame, barely bigger than a thumb drive, but powerful enough to ping a location every 3 seconds. If they took it, he'd know where they went before they even hit the freeway. Then came the bait. He opened the garage door just a few inches, just enough to show the nose of another car. An old, rusted-out station wagon he'd bought for $200 from a guy who used to drag race in high school. It looked pathetic. It also looked easy. Let them get greedy, he thought. Let them try to take both. By midnight, everything was ready. Jake sat in the dark with his phone in one hand and a remote in the other. Thor and Loki lay near the door, ears perked, bodies tensed. They could feel it too. At exactly 12:41 a.m., the first camera pinged. Headlights. The same tow truck. It crept up slowly, engine off, lights dimmed. They parked down the street, then coasted silently to the curb outside Jake's house. Jake didn't move. Through the monitor, he watched as the same 2 men from the previous night stepped out. Reggie Solano, the known scammer, and his sidekick, the guy who nearly got eaten by Loki the last time. They were more cautious now. They scanned the porch for cameras. They didn't see any. Then they checked the garage. "Bingo," Reggie whispered, pointing to the Charger. The second guy hesitated. Man, I don't know. Last time we didn't finish the job, Reggie cut him off. Karen's pissed. This time we get the car. No screw-ups. Jake grinned. He waited until the hook touched the bumper. Then he clicked the remote. The side gate opened with a soft click, and like twin shadows, Thor and Loki launched into the night. Chaos erupted in seconds. Reggie dropped the chain and dove for the truck. Too slow. Loki barreled into him, jaws snapping inches from his leg. Reggie screamed like a horror movie extra and scrambled back under the cab. Meanwhile, Thor had locked onto the second guy, who was now doing a frantic dance around the Charger, screaming, "No, no, no," with every step as Thor snapped at his heels like a furry missile with teeth. Jake stepped outside. No shirt, no shoes, just boxers, fury, and righteous indignation. He folded his arms, watching the scene like a director watching his action sequence play out. "Going somewhere?" he asked. Reggie froze. "This isn't what it looks like," he yelled from the ground. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because it looks exactly like you're trying to steal my car. Again." The second guy tripped over his own feet and fell hard onto the lawn. "We were just following orders," he gasped. "Oh, I know," Jake said, taking a slow step forward. "Karen, right?" Neither answered, but the guilt on their faces was louder than any confession. Then came the sirens. 2 police cruisers rolled up, lights flashing blue and red across the neighborhood like a rave no one wanted to be invited to. Jake didn't even flinch. The 2 tow bandits tried to bolt, but Thor and Loki were already herding them like pro-level sheepdogs. As the officers leapt out, weapons holstered but hands ready, Jake waved. "Evening, officers. Caught him in the act. Again." The same officer from before, Sergeant Morales, walked up, shook his head, and whistled low. "Yep," he said. "This is organized." He pointed to the truck. "Same plates from 3 previous reports in Riverside County. These guys are part of something bigger." Jake looked at Reggie, now face down on the lawn in cuffs. "I'd say you've got enough to nail more than just car theft." Morales nodded. "We'll see what they roll over on." Jake turned toward his porch. His heart was still hammering in his chest, but adrenaline had turned to something else now. Vindication. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, Jake stood across the street from Karen's house as the police returned, this time with a warrant. She opened the door in full glam mode. Blazer, pearls, lipstick so red it could stop traffic. But the second she saw the badge, her color drained faster than the HOA budget during pool renovation season. The lead officer handed her a search warrant. Jake leaned against her porch railing like he owned the place. "Morning, Karen," he said. "You look nervous." She narrowed her eyes. "You think you're clever?" Jake shrugged. "I don't think. I know." An officer stepped out of her house a few minutes later holding a stack of folders. "We've got financial records," he called. "Payments from a towing company to her personal account. This is deep." Karen turned pale. "You can't prove—" "Oh, but we can," Jake interrupted, "because I recorded everything." As the officers placed her in cuffs, Karen twisted to face him one last time, rage bubbling in her voice. "This isn't over!" Jake grinned. "Oh, I think it is." As the squad car rolled away with Karen Monroe in the back seat, Jake turned to Thor and Loki. "Come on, boys," he said, scratching their ears. "Let's go get breakfast. We earned it." But deep down, he knew. This was only round 1. And in the world of HOA power plays and suburban egos, there's always a sequel. I thought it was over. Then her puppet made his move. For the first time in weeks, Jake's driveway felt quiet. No fake tow trucks, no HOA enforcers lurking in the shadows, no letters duct-taped to his mailbox like ransom notes. Just peace. He grilled a steak that night, kicked back on his porch with a cold beer, and watched Thor and Loki chase each other like oversized, over-caffeinated puppies. The neighborhood was eerily still. Even the usual bootlickers had gone silent on the group chat. Karen Monroe was gone. Arrested. Facing serious charges. It should have been over. But of course, it wasn't. The next morning, Jake opened his mailbox and found a cream-colored envelope with a red HOA seal. His stomach dropped before he even opened it. Inside was a formal notice titled, Notice of Formal Review, Violations of Community Standards. Jake skimmed it once, then again, then a third time, just to appreciate how utterly absurd it was. Violations included grass exceeding maximum height by 0.75 inches, mailbox color inconsistency with updated palette guidelines, non-conforming garage light bulb brightness, and, wait for it, continued presence of eyesore vehicle in driveway. The same car they'd tried to steal. Jake let out a humorless laugh. At the bottom of the letter was a signature. Richard Barnes, Vice President, Temecula Oaks HOA. Jake blinked. Richard Barnes? He barely remembered the guy. He was the one who always sat silently in the back of HOA meetings, sipping coffee like he wished he were anywhere else. No opinions, no spine. A human background prop. But now he was sending threats. Jake took the letter inside, laid it on the counter, and just stared at it. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't about grass or light bulbs or mailboxes. This was retaliation. Karen may have been in custody, but her little network was still intact. And Richard? He was next in line for the throne. Jake didn't get mad. He got methodical. He upgraded his cameras, added motion sensors, infrared, two-way audio, floodlights with facial recognition. Thor and Loki got more training drills. He even added decoy violations, painted one side of his mailbox a slightly different color just to see what they'd notice next. And then he waited. 4 nights later, at 2:06 a.m., his motion alert pinged. Jake sat up, grabbed his phone, and pulled up the feed. There, barely a figure in the dark, someone creeping across his lawn, keeping low, staying in the shadows. He enhanced the footage. Hat, hoodie, gloves, flashlight. A man approaching the charger slowly, circling it like a predator casing prey. Jake zoomed in. Richard Barnes. The coward had finally grown a spine. Or maybe he was just stupid. Jake didn't call out. He didn't yell. He just grabbed his jacket and opened the back door. Thor and Loki slipped out beside him, moving low, quiet like trained sentries. Jake circled around the house and emerged behind Richard, who was crouched near the driver's side, poking around the wheel well with a flashlight. Looking for a tracker? Cute. Too bad he was checking the wrong side. A low growl rolled out across the lawn. Richard froze. Slowly, he turned his head and met Thor's eyes first. Then Loki's. Then Jake's. "Oh," Richard croaked. "Hey there." Jake didn't blink. "You lost?" "I was just checking. There's been suspicious activity lately and Jake cut him off. "So naturally you decided to do a solo midnight inspection of my property?" Richard laughed nervously. "Just making sure the neighborhood's safe." "From my legally parked car?" Richard straightened up, waving his hands like surrender flags. "Jake, I know you're upset, but let's not blow this out of proportion. Karen, she may have gone a bit far, but she's out of the picture now. We can move on." Jake stepped closer. "See, I don't think she's out of the picture. I think she's still pulling strings. And you? You're the marionette." "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Jake pointed to the flashlight. "Because I've got video of you snooping around my car at 2 a.m. and a formal violation letter signed by you, miraculously sent right after Karen went down." Richard's face twitched. He glanced toward the street like he was planning a sprint. Jake smirked. "Tell you what," he said. "You leave now, and maybe I don't file a report with the cops. But if I catch you or anyone else from this corrupt HOA circus on my property again, He leaned in. "I'll drag you through every courtroom in California. I've got time, and very expensive lawyers who love this kind of thing." Richard opened his mouth, closed it, and walked off into the dark without another word, flashlight still trembling in his hand. Jake stayed outside a little longer, not because he was paranoid, but because he knew better. People like Karen didn't disappear. They regrouped, and they left little monsters like Richard behind to stir the pot. Thor and Loki sat at his feet, ears still alert, eyes on the street. "Good job, boys," Jake said quietly. But deep inside, something told him. This war wasn't over. Midnight break-in. I caught the HOA's last puppet with my dogs and a crowbar. A few days passed. Peace returned, or at least pretended to. Neighbors waved again. A few even brought over baked goods, whispering things like, "Glad someone finally stood up to her," and "We always knew Karen was shady." Jake accepted the muffins, the nods, the cautious smiles, but he didn't let his guard down. Not for a second. Because people like Richard Barnes didn't just slink away and stay gone. They regrouped, they plotted, and they always came back. So Jake waited. He checked his car every morning. He updated his cameras again. And when nothing happened for 3 days straight, part of him wondered, maybe it was over. Then on the fourth night, something strange happened. The garage door wouldn't open. Jake stood there at dawn, coffee in hand, clicking the remote over and over. Nothing. Not a sound. No grinding, no struggling motor, just silence. He walked around and checked the exterior lock. Scratches, fresh ones, and a dent, small but new. He stared at it for a long second, then turned and walked back inside without saying a word. By 10 o'clock a.m., he had already reviewed the footage. It was subtle, but there it was. At 3:13 a.m., a lone figure crept through the side yard. Black clothes, baseball cap pulled low, gloves, flashlight, a crowbar in hand. The camera caught the man's face for only a second. But 1 second was enough. Richard Barnes. Jake could have called the cops then and there. Instead, he called Tom. "Round 3, Jake said. "Richard tried to break into my garage." "You want to press charges?" Tom asked. "Oh, not yet," Jake replied. "I want him to think he's winning." That night, Jake left the garage door slightly open, just enough to suggest someone forgot to close it all the way. A classic mistake. Tempting, suspicious, and perfect bait. He and Tom waited in the shadows behind the backyard fence, armed with coffee, camera monitors, and 2 very excited Belgian Malinois. Thor and Loki could sense it. Danger was in the air. At 2:18 a.m., the sensor tripped. Movement. The monitors lit up. Richard had returned. He walked up the driveway like he owned the place, head down, scanning for cameras. His hands gripped the crowbar tighter than before. Jake let him get all the way to the door, let him crouch, let him insert the crowbar, let him think this would be easy. Then, with one quiet signal, Jake released Loki. The dog moved like smoke, fast, silent, calculated. Thor followed, just behind, a low rumble already building in his chest. Richard didn't notice them until it was too late. The second growl froze him mid-swing. His hand trembled on the crowbar. He turned his head slowly and met 2 pairs of glowing eyes. "Oh no," he whispered. Jake stepped out from the side of the garage, arms crossed, hoodie pulled over his head. "Can't help yourself, can you?" Richard's voice cracked. I heard, you thought you'd break into my garage for a midnight spa treatment? I wasn't trying to steal anything." "No?" Jake pointed to the crowbar. "You just bring that for emotional support?" "This isn't what it looks like." Jake laughed. "Richard, it's exactly what it looks like. And this time," he pointed to the tree above them. "Smile. You're on 4 different cameras. Infrared, night vision, mic'd up. I even got your license plate when you pulled in." And as if on cue, the sound of sirens tore through the quiet night. Richard flinched, eyes wide, backing up fast. Too late. The squad car rolled into the driveway like an exclamation mark on Jake's sentence. The same officers jumped out. One of them, Officer Morales, recognized Richard instantly. "Third time's not the charm," Morales muttered as he cuffed him. "Breaking and entering, attempted theft, harassment. You're building quite the resume, Mr. Barnes." Richard didn't argue. He just hung his head and let the cuffs click around his wrists. As the patrol car pulled away, Jake turned back to the garage where Thor and Loki sat obediently, tails wagging. "You two deserve steak for this," he said. "Ribeye." He gave each one a scratch behind the ear. Inside, Jake poured himself a drink and sat on the couch in silence. This time, it did feel over. Karen was gone. Richard was gone. The fake tow scams, the threats, the petty revenge plots, it had all unraveled. And Jake? He was still standing, still parked, still watching. The next HOA meeting would be interesting. And if they tried anything else? Well, now the whole neighborhood knew one thing for sure. You don't mess with Jake Miller, and you definitely don't mess with his dogs. They threw a party when she was gone, but I knew it wasn't over. The arrest of Richard Barnes was the final domino. Within days, the HOA board dissolved like cheap sugar in hot coffee. Neighbors who once played dumb suddenly remembered how corrupt everything had been. Fines were quietly refunded. Ridiculous rules were repealed. No more mailbox inspections, no more lawn-length audits, no more threats over the color of your porch light. Jake didn't say "I told you so." He didn't need to. He simply rolled the Charger into the center of his driveway, left it parked with the hood up and polished to a mirror shine. Nobody said a word. Nobody dared. Even Thor and Loki seemed calmer, no longer sleeping in shifts near the door. For the first time in months, they relaxed, sunbathing in the yard like oversized cats with better teeth. It felt like the neighborhood had taken a breath it didn't realize it was holding. Then came the BBQ. It wasn't officially sanctioned by the HOA, because technically there was no functioning HOA anymore, but that didn't stop 35 neighbors from showing up with folding chairs, coolers, casseroles, and a speaker playing nothing but late 80s rock ballads. Someone even brought a cake. Bright red frosting. "Good riddance, Karen." Jake stood by the grill, flipping burgers with one hand and sipping a cold beer with the other. "Did you see the frosting?" Tom asked, nudging him. Jake glanced over. "Petty." "Beautifully petty," Tom corrected. People laughed. Children ran around barefoot. The Charger sat proudly in the background, untouched and gleaming in the golden evening light. Jake should have felt satisfied. And mostly, he did. But there was something. A twitch in his gut. An itch on the back of his neck. That quiet voice that always whispered, "This isn't over yet." It made no sense. Karen was in custody. Richard was facing multiple charges. The HOA board was in shambles. Peace had returned. But Jake didn't trust peace. He'd lived in suburbia long enough to know that just because the Karen you can see is gone, doesn't mean another isn't waiting in the wings. He didn't have to wait long. A week later, Jake found a plain white envelope in his mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just his name, printed in all caps. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 3 words, handwritten in clean, meticulous cursive. "You'll regret this." Jake read it once, then again. Then he laughed. It wasn't nervous laughter. It wasn't angry either. It was the kind of laugh you let out when someone tries to scare you with a water pistol after you've survived a house fire. He showed the note to Tom the next day. Tom snorted. "Karen?" Jake nodded. "Karen. She's still in lockup though, right?" Jake shrugged. "Last I checked." Tom leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against a coffee mug that read, "Trust me, I'm retired, but still dangerous." "Then someone else is playing follow the leader," he said. Maybe one of her little HOA minions trying to stay relevant. Jake didn't respond. He didn't have to, because the next few days were quiet. Too quiet. No letters, no threats, no midnight visits. But Jake didn't mistake silence for surrender. He upgraded his system again. New motion sensors, cloud-based storage, night vision upgrades, even a second backup power supply in case someone tried to cut the lines. Thor and Loki were back on high alert. And then, at exactly 3:04 a.m. on a Thursday morning, Jake's garage door refused to open. He checked the lock. Scratches. Fresh. Again. He reviewed the footage. Same time. Same pattern. A lone figure creeping around the side of his house. And then, there it was. A face. Only visible for a second as the camera caught a clean profile under the dim light of a passing car. Jake paused the video, zoomed in, and smiled. Richard. Again. Out on bail. Back to finish what he started. Jake didn't call the cops. Not yet. He had something better in mind. It was time to end this. For good. This time, he brought a crowbar, so I brought the dogs. The next night, Jake didn't sleep. He didn't even try. Instead, he sat in the dark, sipping black coffee, watching the grainy feed from his garage cameras like a sniper waiting for movement. Thor and Loki sat beside him, alert but patient. They'd done this before, and they knew something was coming. Jake had left the garage door cracked open just enough to tempt a second-rate criminal. A whisper of opportunity. The same bait Richard couldn't resist last time. The air outside was cold. Still, even the crickets had the good sense to stay quiet. At exactly 2:12 a.m., the motion alert chimed. Jake's screen lit up. There he was, Richard Barnes, wearing black from head to toe, a baseball cap pulled low, and, just like last time, a crowbar in hand. Jake shook his head. Guy learns nothing. He waited as Richard crept up the driveway, glancing over his shoulder every few steps. He approached the garage like it might bite him, but greed outweighed fear. Richard crouched, jabbed the crowbar into the lock, and began working it like he had all night to get it right. Jake gave it 30 seconds. Then he gave Loki the signal. The dog moved like a whisper, slipping through the side yard, silent and swift, a shadow with teeth. Thor followed, slower, more deliberate, his low growl rumbling like a warning from beneath the earth. Richard didn't see them until it was too late. A sudden bark cut the night in half. Then another. Richard spun, flashlight dropping to the concrete. And there they were, two enormous Belgian Malinois, eyes glowing, ears pinned, muscles coiled. He froze. Jake stepped into the light, arms crossed, calm as ever. You just can't help yourself, can you? Richard stammered. You were just breaking into my garage, again. This isn't... He backed up a step. This isn't what it looks like. Jake laughed. Buddy, we've done this already. And right then, the sweet, sweet sound of sirens rolled down the street. Again. Richard flinched like he'd been hit. No, no, no. Jake didn't flinch. Oh, yeah. The patrol car screeched to a stop, blue and red lights painting the neighborhood like a bad prom disco. Officer Morales stepped out, already shaking his head. Well, Mr. Barnes, he said, walking up. You just love trespassing, huh? Wait, I can explain. You'll have plenty of time to do that. To a judge. Richard tried to run. Thor cut him off in 2 steps. He stopped, raised his hands, and this time, he didn't even resist when Morales cuffed him. As they led him to the car, he looked over his shoulder at Jake with a face full of hatred and humiliation. You ruined everything, he spat. Jake just smiled. No, he said. You did. The cruiser rolled away. The silence afterward felt earned. Thor and Loki trotted back to Jake's side, tails high, chests puffed out. He crouched down and scratched behind their ears. That's it, boys. We're done. And this time, he meant it. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. The new HOA board, comprised of people who actually lived there and weren't trying to form a mini regime, got to work. They held open meetings. They reviewed all past violations. They canceled every bogus fine, even refunded some. People smiled more, laughed louder. A few residents who used to tow Karen's line now acted like they'd never known her. Jake didn't call them out. He didn't need to. He just parked his Charger right where it belonged, out front, in the driveway, gleaming in the sun, untouched by chains or clipboard warriors. Thor and Loki adjusted to the quiet like pros. They took more naps, chased fewer ghosts, and soaked up every minute of peace like it was warm butter on toast. And then came the BBQ, the second one. This time it wasn't a protest disguised as a party, it was a real celebration. Families gathered in the cul-de-sac. There were bounce houses, burgers. A neighbor even brought a karaoke machine, which Jake silently prayed would break halfway through the first song. Someone made another cake, frosting in blue this time. No more Karens. Jake sat on his porch, a plate of ribs in one hand, Thor's head resting on his foot. For the first time in a long time, he felt something real. Peace. But even as the party laughed on and the embers of the grill glowed in the distance, Jake stayed sharp. Because if there was one thing he'd learned, it was this. There's always another Karen, another clipboard, another fake rule. And the next time one of them tried to stir the pot, Jake Miller and two very protective dogs would be waiting.